Hey guys! Tonight, we are traveling back. Not just a few centuries, not just to castles or kings, but all the way back to the very beginning of us. To the first humans. To the strange, quiet, misty edges of prehistory, where our story as a species actually begins. And here is a secret before we start. Almost everything you were taught about the first humans in school, in documentaries, in cartoons showing a hunched, grunting caveman dragging a club, almost all of it is wrong, or at least, badly oversimplified. The real story is slower, stranger, gentler, in some ways, than the one you grew up with. Early humans were not brutish. They were not stupid. They were not constantly at war, constantly starving, constantly one step from extinction. They loved. They grieved. They made art before they made permanent homes. They cared for their sick and their elderly long before they built a single wall. Tonight, we will walk slowly through 15 of the biggest myths about the first humans, and gently, one by one, we will let them go. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to hold on to a single fact. Just let my voice carry you, the way a river carries a leaf, and let sleep find you whenever it's ready. There is no rush here. History has waited hundreds of thousands of years to be told slowly. It can wait a little longer while you drift off. Before you get too comfortable, if you're enjoying this relaxing journey through history, I'd really appreciate it if you could gently tap the like button and subscribe for more bedtime history stories. And before you drift off, leave me a quick comment telling me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how many different corners of the world we're falling asleep together from. Now, get comfortable, and let's continue our journey. We did not come from apes. Let's start with the biggest misunderstanding of all, the one that gets repeated so often it has practically become common sense. You've heard it before. Someone says, well, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? It sounds clever. It is also based on a mistake. Humans did not come from modern apes. We did not descend from chimpanzees, or gorillas, or any ape walking around today. What actually happened is quieter, and in some ways, more beautiful. Millions of years ago, there was a common ancestor, a creature that was neither human nor chimpanzee, but something else entirely, something now extinct. From that one ancestor, different branches slowly grew outward, like a tree spreading its limbs in the dark. One branch, over unimaginable stretches of time, became chimpanzees. Another branch became gorillas. And another branch, moving slowly, generation by generation, becoming a little more upright, a little more curious, a little more social, eventually became us. So in a sense, chimpanzees are not our ancestors. They are our very distant cousins. We share a family tree, not a direct line. Imagine a family reunion so large, so old, that by the time you traced it back far enough, you and the person across the room shared a great-great-great-grandparent from millions of years ago. You are related, but neither of you came from the other. This matters because the old cartoon image, the one with a hunched ape slowly straightening up, walking upright, step by step, until he becomes a modern man in a suit, was never accurate. Evolution does not move in a straight line toward a goal. It branches. It wanders. It tries things. Some branches survive. Most do not. In fact, scientists now believe that at various points in prehistory, several different human species existed on Earth at the very same time. Not one line quietly walking toward us, but many, overlapping, sometimes meeting, sometimes competing, sometimes, as we will talk about later, even having children together. So if you remember only one thing from tonight, let it be this. We are not the top of a ladder. We are one surviving branch of a much larger, much older tree, most of which has long since gone quiet. Rest with that thought for a moment. There is something calming in it if you let it settle. We are not separate from nature, standing above it. We are simply one of its many quiet experiments, one that happened to keep going. Standing upright was not about being smart. For a long time, the story went like this. Our ancestors got smarter, and because they got smarter, they eventually stood up on two legs. Intelligence first, upright walking second. It felt logical. It fit the idea of humans slowly climbing a ladder toward greatness, brains leading the way. But the fossil record tells a very different story, and it is a much stranger one. Walking upright happened millions of years before brains began to grow larger. Some of the earliest human ancestors we know of, creatures like Ardipithecus and later Australopithecus, walked on two legs while their brains were still roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. Small. Modest. Nothing close to what we'd call clever by later standards. So if intelligence didn't cause upright walking, what did? The honest answer is that scientists are still debating it, and that uncertainty itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Some researchers believe it was about the changing landscape, forests slowly thinning into open grassland, making it more useful to stand tall and see over long grass, to spot predators, to spot food, to travel longer distances efficiently between scattered trees. Others believe it was about the hands, freeing them up to carry things, to carry food back to a group, to carry an infant, to carry a tool. There is something quietly moving in that last idea. That maybe we stood up not to become more dominant, more predatory, more powerful, but to carry things back to each other. To share. Once our ancestors were upright, something interesting happened over the following few million years. Walking on two legs is actually a strange and difficult way to move. It requires enormous balance. A newborn human, even today, cannot walk for the better part of a year after birth, because the skill is that delicate, that hard one. Compare that to a baby deer, standing and walking within hours of being born. We paid a real cost for our upright posture, and yet across millions of years, evolution kept favoring it. And here is the part that surprises most people. Larger brains, the kind we associate with modern humans, did not really begin their dramatic growth until roughly 2 million years ago, long after upright walking was already fully established. Which means, for a period of time longer than modern humans have even existed, our ancestors were walking upright, using simple tools, living in small groups, with brains not all that different in size from other great apes. It's humbling, in a soft way. It suggests our path toward becoming who we are today was not a straight march toward intelligence. It was slow, uneven, full of long stretches where very little seemed to change at all, followed by short bursts where everything did. Let that pace settle into your own body for a moment. You don't have to rush toward anything tonight either. Some of the most important changes happened slowly, quietly, one small adjustment at a time. Fire did not instantly change everything. There's a popular image of fire in the story of early humans. A single dramatic moment, a hero of some tribe capturing flame for the first time, and the very next scene, humans have transformed, cooking meat over roaring fires, gathered warm and safe while the modern age begins. The truth unfolded far more slowly, and over a much longer stretch of time than most people imagine. The earliest solid evidence of humans using fire goes back roughly 1 million years, found in places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where burned bone fragments and ash layers were discovered deep within the cave, far from where lightning could have easily reached. But using fire that already existed, tending a flame that had been sparked by a lightning strike or a natural source, is very different from being able to create fire on demand, whenever it was needed. That second skill, the ability to reliably start a fire from scratch, using friction or sparks, seems to have developed much later, and it likely developed independently, in different times and places, rather than as one single invention that spread everywhere at once. Some groups may have carried fire carefully for generations, protecting embers, passing flame from camp to camp, without ever needing to learn how to create it fresh. And even once fire was more reliably available, it did not instantly transform daily life the way we might assume. Fire is demanding. It needs fuel, and fuel needs to be gathered constantly. It needs tending, someone awake, someone watching, so it does not die out in the night or spread out of control. In many early human groups, keeping a fire alive was likely a shared, ongoing responsibility, something the whole group depended on and contributed to, not unlike how modern households divide the small, unglamorous tasks that keep a home running. What fire did offer, once it became a steady part of life, was something deeper than warmth and cooked food, though of course, both of those mattered enormously. Cooking food does more than make it taste better. It makes many foods safer, softer, and dramatically easier for the body to digest, freeing up energy that had previously gone entirely toward digestion. Some researchers believe this shift, more efficient digestion, more available energy, may have played a real role in supporting the growth of larger brains over time, since brains are remarkably expensive organs to maintain. But perhaps just as important was what fire did to the shape of the evening itself. Before fire, once the sun went down, there was very little to do except sleep. Darkness was mostly empty time. But a fire creates a small circle of light and warmth in the middle of the night, a place where a group can gather after the work of the day is finished. Some anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies have noticed something quietly striking around the campfire at night. The stories people tell change. During the day, conversation tends to focus on practical things, complaints, coordination, small conflicts. But at night, around the fire, people are far more likely to tell stories, myths, memories of the dead, jokes, songs. It's a lovely thought to fall asleep to. That fire didn't just cook our food or warm our bodies. It may have given us something even more essential. A reason, every single night, for the group to sit still together in the dark, and talk, and imagine, and remember. Stone tools were older, and more widespread than we thought. Picture the classic image again. A caveman, crude and grunting, chipping haphazardly at a rock until it becomes a jagged, clumsy tool. It's a scene that suggests tool-making was simple, almost accidental, something any early human could stumble into without much thought. The reality is far more impressive, and it pushes the timeline back much further than most people expect. For decades, the oldest known stone tools were associated with the genus Homo, our own direct lineage, dated to roughly 2.5 million years ago. But in 2015, researchers working at a site called Lomekwi, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, uncovered stone tools dated to approximately 3.3 million years ago. That is older than the genus Homo itself. Which means the toolmakers were not us, not yet, not even close. They were likely earlier hominin species, walking upright, but with brains closer in size to a modern chimpanzee. This discovery quietly rewrote a piece of the story. Toolmaking, it turns out, did not begin with bigger brains and clever, calculating minds. It began earlier, more humbly, as one small skill among many, practiced by creatures who in most other ways would have looked, to us, remarkably ape-like. And the tools themselves, especially in these earliest stages, required more care than the word crude suggests. Making a functional stone tool, even a simple one, involves striking one stone against another at a very particular angle, with a very particular amount of force, again and again, until a sharp flake breaks away in a useful shape. It is a skill. It has to be learned, usually by watching someone else do it first, and then practicing, failing, and trying again. In other words, stone toolmaking was very likely one of humanity's first shared, taught skills, passed from one individual to another, long before language as we know it existed. Over the following millions of years, tool technology slowly grew more refined. Simple sharp flakes gave way to hand axes, symmetrical, carefully shaped tools that appear across huge stretches of Africa, Europe, and Asia, sometimes remaining almost unchanged in style for hundreds of thousands of years at a time. It's worth sitting with that number for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of years, with barely any change in design. Compare that to how quickly technology shifts within a single human lifetime today. For most of our history, change moved at a pace almost too slow for a single generation to notice. Eventually, tools became specialized. Scrapers for preparing hides. Points for spears. Small, delicate blades, some barely bigger than a fingernail, used perhaps for detailed work we can only guess at, sewing, carving, engraving. Each new tool represents not just a technical improvement, but a small act of imagination, someone looking at a plain, ordinary stone and seeing, in their mind, the tool it could become. So the next time you picture early humans with stone tools, let go of the clumsy caveman. Picture instead a patient teacher, sitting cross-legged, showing a child exactly how to strike the stone, at exactly the right angle, passing down a skill that would, in one form or another, be practiced by human hands for millions of years. Neanderthals were not brutish, stupid cavemen. If there is one group of early humans that has been unfairly maligned more than any other, it is the Neanderthals. For over a century, the word Neanderthal has been used almost as an insult, shorthand for someone slow, brutish, unintelligent. That reputation, it turns out, was built on a mistake, and a fairly embarrassing one. Much of the early, negative image of Neanderthals traces back to a single skeleton discovered in France in 1908. The scientist who examined it described a hunched, ape-like posture, dragging knuckles, a shuffling gait. That description shaped the public image of Neanderthals for generations, appearing in textbooks, illustrations, and popular imagination. Decades later, researchers re-examined that same skeleton and discovered the individual had suffered from severe arthritis and other skeletal conditions. The hunched posture wasn't a feature of Neanderthals as a species. It was the specific result of one man's illness, wrongly generalized to an entire, vanished branch of humanity. The real picture of Neanderthals, built from decades of careful research since then, looks completely different. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than those of modern humans. They made sophisticated tools, well-crafted spears, scrapers, and blades, refined over tens of thousands of years. They controlled fire, cooked their food, and in some regions, there is evidence they used fire to process plants that would otherwise have been difficult or even toxic to eat. They also, it seems, cared for one another in ways that go far beyond simple survival instinct. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal skeletons showing signs of severe injuries, a shattered leg, a withered arm, blindness in one eye, injuries that would have made hunting or gathering nearly impossible. And yet, the bones show these injuries had healed, sometimes years before the individual eventually died. Someone brought them food. Someone protected them. Someone cared for them, long after they had stopped being able to contribute to the group in any obvious, practical way. There is also strong evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead deliberately, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with tools placed carefully beside the body, gestures that suggest grief, ritual, and meaning, not mere disposal. And perhaps most remarkable of all, we now know that Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern humans met, and in many cases, had children together. Most people alive today whose ancestry traces back outside of Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, a quiet genetic echo of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. In a very real, biological sense, Neanderthals never fully disappeared. Some part of them is still here, folded gently into the genes of billions of people, carried forward, generation after generation, without most of us ever realizing it. So the next time you hear someone use Neanderthal as an insult, you might quietly remember the truth. A species that cared for its wounded, mourned its dead with flowers, crafted tools with patience and skill, and whose genes still live on, softly, in so many of us today. Language was probably much older than we assumed. For a long time, the assumption was simple and tidy. Language, real language, with grammar and complex meaning, arrived suddenly, sometime around 50,000 years ago, in what some researchers once called a creative explosion. Before that point, the story went, our ancestors communicated mostly through grunts and gestures, simple and limited. The evidence gathered since then paints a slower, more gradual picture, one that pushes the roots of language much deeper into our past. One clue comes from anatomy itself. The hyoid bone, a small, delicate bone in the throat that supports the muscles used in speech, is remarkably human-like in Neanderthal skeletons, suggesting they were physically capable of producing a wide range of complex sounds. Genetic evidence adds another layer. A gene called FOXP2, closely linked to speech and language ability in modern humans, has also been found in the Neanderthal genome, in the same form found in humans today. None of this proves, on its own, that Neanderthals had language exactly as we understand it. But taken together, the anatomy, the genetics, the evidence of complex, coordinated behavior like organized hunting and cooperative care for the injured, many researchers now believe some form of complex communication likely existed far earlier than 50,000 years ago, quite possibly reaching back several 100,000 years, shared in some form across multiple human species, not invented once by us alone. It's worth pausing on what language actually requires, biologically and socially, because it helps explain why it likely didn't appear overnight. Language depends on shared understanding, a group of individuals who agree, without ever writing it down, that a particular sound means a particular thing. It requires memory, patience, and enormous amounts of repetition, children listening, copying, failing, and trying again, for years, before fluency comes. This is not the kind of system that springs into existence all at once. It is the kind of system that has to be built slowly, generation by generation, sound by sound, refined so gradually that no single generation would have noticed the change happening at all. There's something worth carrying gently into sleep tonight, in that idea. That the words you use so effortlessly, without thinking, without any conscious effort at all, may be the end result of a project that took hundreds of thousands of years, quietly assembled by countless people whose names, whose faces, whose very species are now lost entirely to time. Early humans were not constantly at war. Another persistent myth pictures early human life as endless, brutal conflict, small warring bands locked in constant violence, a world governed entirely by survival of the fiercest, the strongest, the cruelest. This idea has been used, at various points in history, to justify all sorts of modern behavior, the argument going that if violence is simply human nature, then perhaps it cannot, and should not, be questioned. The archaeological evidence tells a more complicated, and in many ways, gentler story. For the vast majority of human prehistory, the evidence of large-scale, organized warfare, mass graves, defensive fortifications, weapons clearly designed for fighting other humans rather than hunting animals, is surprisingly rare. Most early human groups appear to have been small, mobile, and spread thinly across the landscape. With so few people and so much open land, there was often simply less to fight over, and more room to walk away from tension rather than escalate it. That is not to say early human life was free of violence altogether. Individual conflicts certainly happened, as they do in nearly every social species on Earth. But organized, large-scale warfare, the kind involving dozens or hundreds of people planning and executing coordinated violence against another group, appears far more clearly in the archaeological record only after humans began settling into permanent communities, after agriculture, after the accumulation of stored food, land, and property, things worth defending and worth taking. In fact, many researchers who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living approximation we have to how early humans may have lived, note that cooperation, not conflict, tends to be the far more dominant, everyday feature of daily life. Sharing food across an entire group, even with those who did not personally contribute to a hunt that day, was often not just common, but expected, almost a kind of social insurance, a way of ensuring that when your own luck ran out, others would share with you in turn. There's a quiet, comforting idea buried in all of this. That for the overwhelming majority of the time our species has existed on this earth, cooperation was not the exception. It was closer to the rule. We survived, not primarily because we were the fiercest predators on the savannah, but because we learned, patiently, generation after generation, how to depend on each other. Art existed far earlier than we once believed. For a long time, the story of human creativity had a clean, dramatic beginning. Somewhere around 40,000 years ago, it was believed, something shifted in the human mind, and suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, humans began painting. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet in France, with their extraordinarily lifelike horses, bison, and lions, seem to support this idea of a sudden creative awakening. More recent discoveries have quietly pushed this timeline back much further, and in doing so, have complicated the tidy story considerably. In a cave called Blombos, on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists uncovered pieces of ochre, a reddish mineral pigment, engraved with deliberate, geometric crosshatch patterns, dated to roughly 75,000 years ago. Nearby, they also found shell beads, deliberately pierced and worn smooth, likely strung together as jewelry, dated to a similarly ancient age. These are not accidental marks. Geometric engraving requires planning, a steady hand, and very likely, some shared cultural understanding of what the pattern meant, or at least, that it mattered enough to be made carefully and repeated. Even more striking, in 2018, researchers dated a cave painting in Indonesia, on the island of Sulawesi, depicting what appears to be a hunting scene with therianthropes, figures that are part human, part animal, to at least 43,000 years ago, and possibly older. And in a separate cave on the same island, a painting of a wild pig was dated to at least 45,500 years ago, making it, at the time of its discovery, among the oldest known figurative artworks in the world. What these discoveries suggest, taken together, is that art wasn't a single sudden invention that happened once, in one place, and then spread outward like a spark catching fire. It seems to have emerged, independently, in different forms, in different regions, over an enormous span of time, suggesting that the impulse to create, to mark a surface with meaning, to decorate the body, to represent the world symbolically, was already deeply present in the human mind, and perhaps in other closely related species as well, long before the famous cave paintings of France were ever made. There is something worth resting on here, as your own eyes grow heavier. Long before humans built permanent homes, before farming, before writing, before almost every technology we now consider essential, we were already decorating shells to wear around our necks, and carefully engraving patterns into stone, for no practical survival reason at all. Simply, it seems, because it felt meaningful to do so. The migration out of Africa was not one single journey. The old story is simple, almost like a single line drawn across a map. Humans evolved in Africa, and then, at some point, walked out, in one great migration, spreading steadily across the globe until every continent was reached. It's a clean, satisfying narrative. It is also, according to the evidence, far too simple. Modern genetic and archaeological research suggests that humans left Africa not once, but multiple times, in different waves, at different periods, using different routes, and that many of these early attempts likely ended not in successful, lasting settlement, but in failure, the small groups eventually dying out, leaving little or no genetic trace in the populations living in those regions today. Fossil evidence, for example, places early modern humans in the region of modern-day Israel and Greece as far back as 190,000 years ago, and possibly earlier, tens of thousands of years before the migration that would eventually populate the rest of the world outside Africa. These early pioneers, it seems, did not go on to become the ancestors of the billions of people living outside Africa today. Their journey, for reasons we may never fully understand, climate shifts, disease, competition with other human species already living in the region, simply did not continue. The migration that did eventually succeed, the one whose genetic traces can still be found in the DNA of most people outside Africa today, appears to have happened later, sometime around 60 to 70,000 years ago. But even this successful migration was not one tidy, single-file line of people walking purposefully toward a destination. It was almost certainly a slow, uneven drift, small groups moving a little further along a coastline, or a little further up a river valley, over the course of many, many generations, most of them with no concept at all that they were part of some larger, historic migration. They were simply following food, following rivers, following the seasons, the way countless species have always moved. Along the way, these small, drifting groups encountered other human species who had left Africa far earlier, and had already been living across Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, a mysterious and only recently discovered human species, across parts of Asia. And in various pockets, smaller, more localized populations, some of which have left only fragmentary evidence behind, hints of people we may never fully understand. These meetings, between our direct ancestors and these other, older human lineages, were not always peaceful in every case, but they were also, we now know with certainty, not always hostile. In many cases, quite the opposite. They had children together, and the genetic echo of those unions is written, quietly, into the DNA of billions of people alive today, a soft reminder that the map of human history was never one single line. It was closer to a slow, tangled, overlapping web drawn and redrawn over hundreds of thousands of years. Early human family and social bonds ran deep. The old caveman stereotype often includes a particular, unpleasant image, the idea of early human relationships as crude and purely physical, driven by instinct alone, without anything resembling deeper emotional bonds, family loyalty, or long-term care. The evidence tells a very different, and far warmer, story. We've already talked about Neanderthal skeletons showing signs of injuries that healed only because someone cared for the wounded individual, sometimes for years. That kind of long-term care requires more than instinct. It requires memory, patience, and a genuine investment in another person's survival, even when that person can offer nothing useful in return for a long stretch of time. Burial practices offer another quiet window into these bonds. Across many early human sites, bodies were not simply left behind or discarded. They were deliberately buried, sometimes in a curled, resting position, sometimes with objects placed carefully beside them, tools, ochre pigment, occasionally flowers, based on pollen evidence found at certain sites. These are not the actions of a species indifferent to loss. They suggest grief, memory, and a wish to mark the importance of another life, even after it had ended. Anthropologists studying present-day hunter-gatherer societies, again, our best living window into these patterns, consistently find that grandparents play an enormously important, active role in early human social structures. In fact, some researchers point to what's known as the grandmother hypothesis to help explain a genuinely unusual feature of human biology, that human females, unlike most other mammals, tend to live for decades after they are no longer able to have children themselves. In many other species, this simply doesn't happen. But in human groups, an older, experienced woman who can no longer bear children can still gather food, share knowledge, and directly help care for her grandchildren, freeing up her own daughters to have more children sooner, and more safely. Children, too, appear to have been cared for collectively, not solely by their biological parents. In many hunter-gatherer societies studied today, child rearing is a genuinely shared responsibility across the entire group, aunts, uncles, older cousins, and unrelated adults all playing an active, hands-on role. Some anthropologists refer to this as cooperative breeding, and believe it may have been a defining, essential feature of early human social life for an enormous stretch of our evolutionary history. One of the quiet reasons our species was able to raise unusually helpless, slow-developing infants successfully, generation after generation. There's something worth letting settle gently into your chest as sleep approaches. Long before written history, long before any record was kept, human beings were already doing this. Caring for each other's children. Sitting with the sick. Burying the dead with tenderness. Not because any law demanded it. Simply because, it seems, it is who we have always, quietly, been. The first human diet was not just meat, and not just caves. The cartoon image lingers here too. A caveman, dragging a club, gnawing on a raw slab of meat beside a fire, living permanently inside a dark, damp cave. In reality, the diet and dwelling patterns of early humans were far more varied, and far more resourceful, than that simple picture suggests. Archaeological evidence, particularly the analysis of ancient dental plaque, wear patterns on teeth, and preserved plant remains at old campsites, shows that early human diets were remarkably broad and flexible. Yes, meat was part of it, when available, an efficient, calorie-dense food worth the effort of hunting or scavenging. But so were roots, tubers, nuts, seeds, fruits, leafy greens, and, in many regions, substantial amounts of fish and shellfish gathered from rivers, lakes, and coastlines. In some coastal sites in South Africa, researchers have found extensive evidence of early humans systematically harvesting shellfish tens of thousands of years ago, carefully timed, it seems, to the tides. This dietary flexibility mattered enormously for survival. A group that depends entirely on one single food source is vulnerable. One bad season, one migration pattern shift among prey animals, and starvation follows quickly. But a group capable of eating dozens of different plants, several kinds of animals, insects, shellfish, and whatever else the local landscape happened to offer that season, had a significant survival advantage. This flexibility likely helped our ancestors adapt successfully to an extraordinary range of environments, from dense rainforests to open savanna, to cold, exposed coastlines, environments where a more specialized, narrow diet simply would not have worked. As for the caves, while some early human groups certainly did use caves, particularly as shelter during colder seasons or as protection at night, caves were never the primary, permanent dwelling for most early humans across most of our history. Many groups were highly mobile, following seasonal food sources, and built lightweight, temporary shelters instead, simple structures made from branches, animal hides, and readily available materials, shelters that could be built quickly and just as easily left behind when the group moved on. Evidence of these more perishable, temporary shelters is naturally far harder to find in the archaeological record than the more durable evidence left behind in caves, which may be part of why caves have come to dominate our popular imagination of early human life so heavily, even though they represent only one part of a much more varied, adaptable way of living. So if the phrase caveman comes to mind again as you drift off tonight, you might gently correct it. Not caveman. Traveler. Forager. Someone who understood, deeply and practically, the changing rhythms of the land, the tides, and the seasons, and who moved, patiently, wherever that knowledge led. Death was never treated lightly. It's tempting to imagine early humans as being emotionally distant from death, hardened by how common it was, how close it always sat to daily life, disease, childbirth, accident, predator, all constant, quiet threats in a world without modern medicine. Surely, the thinking goes, if death was so common, it must have meant less. The archaeological evidence suggests almost the opposite. Some of the oldest deliberate burials we know of come from a site called Kafseh in modern-day Israel, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. There, researchers found a human skeleton, a child, buried carefully with deer antlers placed gently across the chest. Nearby, other burials at the same site show similarly deliberate, careful placement, bodies curled, positioned with what appears to be real intention, not simply left where they fell. At a site called Sunjir, in modern-day Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered two children buried together, head to head, covered in an almost unbelievable number of ivory beads, more than 10,000 of them, along with spears carved from mammoth tusks, and decorative items that would have taken, by some estimates, thousands of hours of skilled labor to create. Whoever these children were, their community devoted an enormous, almost unimaginable amount of time, skill, and precious material to honoring them in death. These are not the actions of a species treating death as something ordinary, something to be shrugged off. They suggest grief. They suggest ritual. They suggest a community coming together, deliberately, to mark a loss that mattered deeply to them, using whatever resources, however scarce, however hard-won, that they had. Even earlier, and more mysteriously, there is a site in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, where the remains of at least 28 individuals, dated to over 400,000 years ago, were found at the bottom of a deep vertical shaft inside a cave system. Among the bones, researchers found a single, beautifully crafted stone hand axe, made from a reddish quartzite, a material not found naturally anywhere near the cave. Some researchers have proposed, cautiously, that this hand axe may have been deliberately placed there, perhaps as a kind of offering, though this interpretation remains genuinely debated among scientists, and we may never know for certain. What we can say, with much greater confidence, is that across an enormous span of human prehistory, in many different times, places, and even among different human species, death was met with care, with ritual, and very often, with objects and effort that served no practical, survival purpose at all. They existed for one reason only: to honor someone who had been loved and who was now gone. Denisovans, our lost, mysterious cousins. Of all the discoveries about early humans made in recent decades, few are as strange, or as quietly humbling, as the story of the Denisovans. In 2010, researchers analyzing a tiny fragment of bone, a single finger bone, found in Denisova cave in Siberia, discovered something that didn't match any known human species. Not modern humans. Not Neanderthals. Something else entirely, a previously unknown branch of the human family tree, identified almost entirely through genetic analysis rather than a complete, recognizable skeleton. We still know remarkably little about what Denisovans actually looked like. Unlike Neanderthals, whose remains have been found across dozens of well-preserved sites, our physical evidence of Denisovans remains frustratingly sparse: a handful of bone fragments, a few teeth, part of a jaw. And yet, despite this scarcity of physical remains, we know they existed, and we know quite a lot about their impact, because of the genetic traces they left behind in living human populations today. Certain populations in modern Papua New Guinea, parts of Melanesia, and other regions of Southeast Asia and Oceania carry a surprisingly significant percentage of Denisovan DNA in their genomes, in some cases, several percent of their entire genetic makeup. This suggests that Denisovans and the ancestors of modern humans met in that region and had children together, just as modern humans and Neanderthals did further west. Even more remarkably, one particular gene inherited from Denisovans, found today in Tibetan populations, appears to help the body function more efficiently at extremely high altitudes, where oxygen is scarce. In other words, a genetic gift, passed down from a nearly forgotten human species we barely understand, quietly continues to help people survive and thrive today, high in the mountains, tens of thousands of years after the Denisovans themselves disappeared entirely from the fossil record. There is something almost dreamlike in this story, fitting, perhaps, for tonight. An entire branch of humanity, so mysterious we still don't know their faces, their voices, or how they lived day to day, and yet, we carry pieces of them inside us, written quietly into our genes, still shaping, in small ways, who survives, and where, and how. The first inventions were collective, not individual. We tend to imagine invention as a solitary flash of genius, one brilliant person, alone, suddenly solving a problem that had stumped everyone before them. It's a satisfying story, the kind that makes for a good documentary narrator's dramatic pause. But when it comes to the earliest human innovations, tools, fire starting, clothing, shelter, this individual genius model rarely fits the evidence. Consider clothing. We don't have surviving fabric from hundreds of thousands of years ago, since organic material like animal hide and woven plant fiber decomposes quickly. But researchers have found an ingenious workaround, studying the genetics of human body lice, which, unlike head lice, can only survive in clothing. By calculating roughly when body lice genetically diverged from head lice as a separate population, scientists estimate that clothing was likely in regular use by at least 170,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. That's not the result of one clever individual's sudden idea. It's the result of countless generations, slowly refining a set of shared skills, scraping hides, softening them, cutting and shaping them, sewing them together using bone needles, a technology that itself required significant, dedicated skill to produce. Bone needles with tiny, deliberately drilled eyes have been found at sites dating back at least 40,000 years, and their appearance closely correlates, in some regions, with the successful expansion of modern humans into much colder, harsher climates than earlier human groups had managed to survive in for long. A single needle looks small and unremarkable sitting in a museum case. But it represents an enormous, cumulative achievement, generations of trial and error, patiently teaching children, who would grow up to teach their own children in turn, a chain of knowledge stretching across thousands of years. This pattern, cumulative culture, built slowly, generation upon generation, rather than invented suddenly by a lone genius, appears again and again throughout early human technology. It suggests something quietly profound about our species. Our greatest advantage was never really about any single individual's raw intelligence. It was about our extraordinary capacity to learn from each other, to teach patiently, to copy carefully, and to pass forward, generation after generation, small improvements that no single person could have discovered alone in one lifetime. We are still, quietly, becoming. If there's one final myth worth letting go of tonight, it's the idea that human evolution is a finished story, that we are the fixed, final result of a long process that has now, essentially, stopped. It hasn't stopped. It never really does. Human evolution continues today, though it moves at a pace far too slow to notice within a single lifetime, the same patient, invisible pace that shaped every change we've talked about tonight. Genetic studies have found evidence of relatively recent evolutionary changes within just the last several thousand years, including the widespread ability among many adult populations to digest lactose, milk sugar, a trait that appears to have spread rapidly alongside the rise of dairy farming in regions where drinking milk into adulthood offered a genuine survival advantage. We are not the endpoint of some grand design, moving steadily toward perfection. We are, and have always been, simply the current chapter of an extremely long, ongoing, unfinished story, one shaped as much by accident and circumstance as by anything resembling a plan. And maybe that's a gentle thought to end on tonight. Every single thing we've talked about, upright walking, fire, tools, language, art, burial, love, care for the sick and the elderly, none of it arrived instantly. None of it was inevitable. It was built slowly, patiently, by countless people whose names we will never know, across a span of time so vast it is genuinely difficult for the human mind to hold on to. And here you are, tonight, warm, safe, resting somewhere quiet, carrying all of it forward inside you, without even trying. Every skill your ancestors slowly developed. Every quiet act of care passed down, unbroken, generation after generation, all the way to this exact moment, this exact bed, this exact breath. You don't have to do anything else tonight. You don't have to remember any of this. Just let it rest gently in the back of your mind, the way a river settles at the end of a long, slow journey to the sea. That missing link was never really missing. For over a century, popular science writing loved to talk about the missing link, some single, dramatic fossil that would finally connect apes to humans in one clean, satisfying leap. It's a phrase that still shows up sometimes today, usually attached to a new fossil discovery, promising to finally solve the mystery once and for all. But the phrase itself rests on a flawed idea, the notion that human evolution is a single chain, with one link missing that, once found, would complete the picture. In reality, as we talked about earlier, human evolution looks much more like a branching bush than a chain. And the fossil record, while still incomplete in many places, is far richer than the phrase "missing link" suggests. We have Australopithecus afarensis, made famous by the skeleton nicknamed Lucy, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, walking upright over 3 million years ago. We have Homo habilis, handyman, associated with early stone tools. We have Homo erectus, a remarkably successful species that survived, in some regions, for close to 2 million years, longer than our own species has existed so far by a wide margin. We have Homo naledi, a strange, small-brained species discovered in a South African cave system so difficult to access that researchers believe the bodies may have been deliberately placed there, an idea that, if true, would push the origins of deliberate burial back far earlier than anyone previously imagined. Each new fossil discovery doesn't complete a single missing gap in a simple chain. It adds another branch, another cousin, another quiet variation on the theme of what it might mean to be human. The tree keeps getting richer, not simpler. There is something worth carrying into sleep in that image. Perhaps you don't need every piece of your own story figured out either, every gap explained, every uncertainty resolved. Perhaps, like the human family tree itself, your story can remain rich, branching, and a little bit mysterious, and still be whole. Homo erectus, the quiet, long-lived wanderers. If any early human species deserves far more recognition than it usually gets, it might be Homo erectus. While Neanderthals and, more recently, Denisovans tend to capture public imagination, Homo erectus quietly holds one of the most remarkable records in the entire story of human evolution: longevity. Homo erectus first appears in the fossil record roughly 2 million years ago, and some populations appear to have survived, in certain isolated regions such as the island of Java in Indonesia, until perhaps just over 100,000 years ago. Pause on that span for a moment. Nearly 2 million years. Modern humans, by comparison, have existed for perhaps 300,000 years at most, a small fraction of the time Homo erectus successfully persisted. Homo erectus was also, as far as we know, the first human species to leave Africa in significant numbers, spreading across huge stretches of Asia and reaching as far as the islands of modern-day Indonesia, a journey that, at some points, likely required crossing open water, a genuinely impressive feat for a species without anything resembling modern boats. They were skilled toolmakers, associated with a refined style of hand axe that remained in steady use, largely unchanged, for well over 1 million years. They likely used fire. Some evidence suggests they cared for injured or aging members of their group, much like Neanderthals did later. And they did all of this while slowly, gradually spreading across an enormous range of different climates and environments, adapting successfully to each one in turn. We don't know what Homo erectus's inner life was like. We don't know if they had anything resembling language as we'd recognize it, or complex belief, or grief in the way we understand it. Their story is quieter, more distant, harder to reach than that of the Neanderthals or Denisovans, whose genes still live on directly in people today. But their success, nearly 2 million years of survival, across 3 continents, through ice ages and warm periods alike, deserves to be remembered, even in its quiet, patient, unglamorous way. The ice ages did not simply freeze everything still. When people picture the Ice Age, the image is often total, an entire world locked uniformly under snow and glacier, humans huddled desperately in caves, waiting for it to end. The reality was far more varied, and in some ways, far more interesting. Ice ages did not mean the entire globe was frozen solid all at once. Even during the coldest, most extreme glacial periods, vast regions of the Earth remained ice-free, and in some cases, surprisingly hospitable. Areas of Africa, southern Asia, and parts of what is now the southern United States remained comparatively mild, while enormous ice sheets, in some places over a mile thick, covered much of northern Europe, northern Asia, and North America. For early humans living within or near these colder regions, the Ice Ages presented genuine, serious challenges, but also, in their own way, opportunities. As enormous amounts of the Earth's water became locked away in glacial ice, sea levels around the world dropped significantly, in some periods by more than 300 feet compared to today. This exposed vast stretches of land that are now underwater, land bridges connecting regions that today are separated by ocean. The most famous of these is likely Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska, allowing early humans to walk, rather than sail, from Asia into the Americas, sometime during the last Ice Age. Ice Age humans also developed increasingly sophisticated technology to cope with cold climates, well-fitted, tailored clothing sewn with bone needles, as we discussed earlier, semi-permanent shelters built in some regions from the bones and tusks of mammoths, when wood was scarce, and highly efficient hunting strategies targeting the large, cold-adapted animals that thrived in these harsh environments, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and reindeer. Far from being a simple, passive period of huddled survival, the Ice Ages appear to have been a period of genuine, active human ingenuity, adaptation, and, in certain regions, even expansion into entirely new continents. Cold, difficult conditions, it turns out, did not simply freeze human progress. In many ways, they seem to have quietly pushed it forward. Early humans understood the sky long before writing. Long before calendars, before clocks, before any written record, early humans were already careful, patient observers of the night sky, and the evidence for this quiet, ancient attentiveness is more compelling than most people realize. At a site in Germany called the Ack Valley, archaeologists uncovered a small ivory carving, roughly 17,000 years old, that some researchers believe may represent a lunar calendar, a sequence of carved notches that seems to track the phases of the moon across roughly 2.5 months. Similar patterns of notched bones and antlers, sometimes referred to as tally sticks, have been found at multiple sites across Europe, dating back tens of thousands of years, and while their exact meaning remains genuinely debated among researchers, many scholars believe at least some of them were used to track time, whether lunar cycles, seasons, or the passage of days. understanding the rhythm of the seasons, when certain plants would bear fruit, when particular animals would migrate through a region, when rivers would flood or freeze, was not a luxury for early humans. It was essential, practical knowledge, quite literally a matter of survival, passed down carefully from one generation to the next, likely through spoken stories long before it was ever carved into bone or stone. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that certain prehistoric cave paintings may contain deliberately encoded seasonal or astronomical information, using specific animal symbols to represent particular months or star patterns, though this remains a more speculative and actively debated area of research. What is far less speculative is this: early humans were watching the sky, tracking the moon, marking the passage of time in careful, deliberate ways, tens of thousands of years before the first writing system was ever developed in Mesopotamia. There is something quietly reassuring in that thought as you drift towards sleep tonight. That the same moon you might glimpse tonight through a gap in the curtains was once watched, just as carefully, just as patiently, by human eyes an unimaginable number of generations before your own, its slow, steady phases offering comfort and guidance long, long before anyone thought to write a single word down. Music may be older than we ever imagined. If art and language have deep, ancient roots, so too, it turns out, does music. In 2008, archaeologists working in Hole Fels Cave in Germany uncovered a flute carved from a vulture's wing bone, dated to at least 35,000 years ago, complete with carefully carved finger holes, precisely spaced to allow specific, controlled notes to be played. It is, remarkably, still playable today, and researchers who have reconstructed similar flutes report that they produce a clear, haunting, surprisingly sophisticated range of tones. This wasn't a lone, isolated discovery. Similar bone flutes, crafted with comparable care and technical skill, have been found at several other European sites from a similar time period, suggesting that musical instrument making wasn't a rare, isolated invention by one particularly creative individual, but a genuine, shared cultural practice, understood and passed down across different groups. Making a working flute from bone is not a simple, casual task. It requires understanding acoustics, at least on a practical, intuitive level, precisely spacing finger holes to produce specific, harmonious notes, and considerable patience and skill in carving and hollowing delicate bone without breaking it. Whoever made these instruments were, in every meaningful sense, skilled artisans and, quite possibly, dedicated, practiced musicians. Beyond instruments, some researchers believe humans, and quite possibly Neanderthals as well, were singing and vocalizing rhythmically long before any instrument was ever carved. Group singing, chanting, and rhythmic vocalization appear, in studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, to serve important social functions, strengthening group bonds, coordinating shared tasks, soothing infants, and marking important, meaningful occasions, births, deaths, seasonal changes, successful hunts. It's a gentle thought to hold on to as you drift off tonight. That somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, around a fire much like the one we imagined earlier, someone lifted a carefully carved bone flute to their lips, and played a slow, haunting melody into the cold night air, for reasons that, in the most important ways, likely weren't so different from why we still make music today. to express something words alone couldn't quite capture. To bring a tired, weary group a little closer together at the end of a long, difficult day. Early humans traveled much farther than we assumed. There's a persistent assumption that early human groups, without modern transportation, must have stayed close to home, rarely venturing far from a single, familiar territory across an entire lifetime. The archaeological evidence, once again, tells a more surprising story. Researchers studying certain prehistoric tools have discovered raw materials, particular types of stone, shell, or obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass prized for its extremely sharp edges, at sites located hundreds of miles from where that specific material naturally occurs. This doesn't necessarily mean any single individual walked that entire distance personally. More likely, these valuable materials moved gradually, through extended trade and exchange networks, passed from one group to a neighboring group, and then onward again, slowly traveling great distances over the course of months or years, much like a message passed carefully down a very long line of people. But there is also direct evidence of genuinely long individual journeys. The most striking example may be the earlier mentioned migration of Homo erectus and, later, modern humans, into the islands of Southeast Asia, journeys that, at certain points, required crossing significant stretches of open water, even during periods of lower sea levels when many islands were more closely connected than they are today. Reaching the Pacific island of Flores, for instance, home to the famously small, now extinct human species nicknamed the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, would have required crossing open ocean, even during the most favorable Ice Age conditions. This suggests something remarkable about early human curiosity and capability, a willingness, even without modern boats or navigation tools, to look out across open water toward a distant, unknown shore, and decide, deliberately, to cross it anyway. Early humans, it seems, were not simply passive wanderers, drifting slowly wherever food happened to lead them. They were, at least some of the time, genuine explorers, curious about what lay beyond the next valley, the next river, the next stretch of open water, willing to take real, meaningful risks in pursuit of the unknown. Early human health was not simply survival of the fittest. There's a common assumption that early human life, without modern medicine, must have been governed by a harsh, unforgiving rule: only the strongest, healthiest individuals survived, while anyone sick, injured, or disabled was quickly left behind or abandoned by the group. We've already touched on strong evidence contradicting this: the healed injuries found in Neanderthal skeletons, injuries so severe they would have made self-sufficient survival impossible without sustained help from others. But this pattern of care extends further, and appears across many different early human populations and time periods, not as a rare exception, but as a recurring, meaningful pattern. At a site in Vietnam, researchers examined the skeleton of a young man who lived roughly 4,000 years ago, whose remains showed evidence of a condition that would have left him paralyzed from the waist down from a very young age, likely due to a genetic disorder. Despite this, he lived for many years into adulthood, well beyond what would have been possible without extensive, ongoing care, being fed, cleaned, and protected by others in his community for years on end. Similarly, researchers studying skeletal remains from various prehistoric sites across Europe have documented cases of individuals who survived into old age despite severe arthritis, missing limbs, blindness, or other conditions that would have made independent survival essentially impossible in a world without modern accommodation or support. This pattern suggests something important about how we should understand early human social structures. Survival wasn't purely a matter of individual physical strength or health. It was, very often, a matter of belonging to a group willing to invest real time, effort, and scarce resources into keeping its most vulnerable members alive, not because it offered any immediate practical advantage, but, it seems, simply because that vulnerable person was valued and mattered to the people around them. Compassion, it turns out, is not a recent invention, led onto human nature only after civilization, cities, and written moral codes arrived. The evidence suggests it runs far deeper than that, present in some of the very oldest chapters of our story, quietly practiced by people whose names we will never know, in eras far more difficult, in most practical ways, than our own. Early humans likely had rich emotional lives. It's easy, looking back across such an enormous span of time, to imagine early humans as somehow emotionally simpler than we are today, driven mostly by basic, immediate needs, hunger, fear, the urge to reproduce, without much room for the more complex emotional and psychological lives we associate with modern people. But everything we've discussed tonight quietly pushes back against that assumption. Grief expressed through careful, deliberate burial. Joy and connection expressed through music and dance. Curiosity expressed through art, exploration, and careful observation of the night sky. Deep, sustained compassion expressed through the patient care of the sick, the injured, and the elderly, sometimes over the course of many years. Researchers who study the emotional and social capacities of our closest living animal relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, have documented behavior that hints at complex inner lives, grief displayed after the death of a close companion, apparent empathy toward injured group members, even behavior that some researchers interpret as a rudimentary sense of fairness. If our closest living relatives display hints of this emotional complexity, it seems reasonable, even likely, that our early human ancestors, who were significantly more socially complex, better at communication, and living in larger, more interconnected groups, experienced an emotional life at least as rich, and quite possibly considerably richer. We will likely never know, with any real certainty, exactly what it felt like to be an early human, standing beside a fire 50,000 years ago, watching a child sleep, mourning a lost companion, or gazing up at a night sky utterly free of any artificial light. But the physical evidence they left behind, carefully, deliberately, across hundreds of thousands of years, speaks quietly, but persistently, of beings who loved, who grieved, who wondered, and who cared for one another, in ways not so different, at their core, from how we still love, grieve, wonder, and care for one another today. The idea of primitive people was always a flawed one. Throughout tonight's stories, we've gently corrected one myth after another, all of them connected by a common thread, the deeply rooted assumption that early humans were somehow lesser than us, simpler, cruder, less intelligent, less emotionally developed. It's worth pausing, gently, to ask where that assumption originally came from, because it wasn't purely a product of missing scientific evidence. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, ideas about primitive versus advanced peoples were often shaped as much by prevailing social and political biases of the era as by careful, objective science. Early anthropologists and archaeologists frequently carried deeply ingrained assumptions about their own society's inevitable superiority, and those assumptions quietly, sometimes unconsciously, shaped how they interpreted the evidence they found, often assuming the least generous, most simplistic explanation available whenever an early human behavior appeared complex or sophisticated. Modern archaeology and anthropology, informed by more careful, and importantly, more self-aware methods, have spent the past several decades slowly, patiently correcting course. Each new careful excavation, each new advanced genetic study, each new re-examination of old assumptions with fresh, more rigorous eyes, has tended to reveal early humans, and our related, now extinct cousins, as more capable, more thoughtful, and more emotionally complex than previously assumed, not less. This matters beyond simple historical curiosity. How we think about our own distant ancestors shapes, in quiet ways, how we think about human nature itself. Whether we assume cooperation or conflict comes more naturally to us, whether we assume compassion is a fragile, recent invention or a deep, ancient inheritance. The evidence, gathered patiently across dozens of research fields, increasingly points toward the second, gentler possibility. What the first humans might think of us now. Let's end with a quiet thought experiment, nothing scientific, just something gentle to imagine as sleep finally arrives. If somehow, impossibly, an early human from 100,000 years ago could sit beside you tonight, in your quiet, warm room, what might surprise them most? Perhaps not the glowing screens, or the soft hum of electricity, or the impossible convenience of food arriving at your door within the hour. Perhaps, instead, what would surprise them most is how alone so many of us have become, sleeping in separate rooms, in separate houses, often streets or miles away from our closest family, in a way that would have been almost unthinkable for most of human history, when small groups slept closely together for warmth, for safety, and for comfort, night after night, generation after generation. And yet, in other ways, perhaps they would recognize you immediately, and feel a quiet, easy familiarity. The tired ache in your shoulders after a long day. The comfort of a soft blanket pulled up around your chin. The particular, universal relief of finally lying down after being upright and moving since the moment the sun rose. The quiet hope, present in every human heart across every single era, that tomorrow might be a little easier, a little kinder, than today. Across hundreds of thousands of years, across dozens of different human species, across countless languages now entirely lost and forgotten, across ice ages and warm periods, migrations and settlements, war and, far more often, quiet cooperation, one thread has remained remarkably constant. At the end of each long day, human beings have always needed rest. They have always sought softness, warmth, and safety, wherever it could be found. And they have always, in their own way, been comforted by voices, low and steady in the dark, speaking gently until sleep finally arrived. Tonight, that voice is mine. And it's simply here to say, you've done enough for today. You can rest now. Our closest living relatives still teach us about ourselves. Before we drift fully into the closing part of tonight's story, it's worth spending a little time with our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, because studying them carefully has quietly reshaped how scientists understand early human behavior. Chimpanzees, researchers have observed over decades of patient field study, use simple tools in the wild, stripping leaves from twigs to fish termites out of a mound, using stones to crack open tough nuts, techniques that are not instinctive, but are carefully taught, watched, and practiced by younger members of a group observing older, more experienced individuals. Different chimpanzee communities, living in different regions, even display distinct, local cultures, different preferred tools, different techniques, passed down within a specific group but not shared with neighboring communities, in much the same way human cultural traditions vary distinctly from one region to another. Bonobos, meanwhile, close genetic relatives to chimpanzees but markedly different in social behavior, live in societies that are notably less aggressive, and where conflicts are very often resolved not through violence, but through social bonding, gentle touch, and cooperative behavior. For decades, popular science leaned heavily on chimpanzee aggression as the presumed model for understanding early human nature. More recent, careful research increasingly suggests bonobos may offer just as valuable, and in some ways, a more balanced, complete picture of what our shared evolutionary inheritance might actually include: capacities for both conflict and remarkable, gentle cooperation, held together within the very same species. None of this means humans are simply like chimpanzees or like bonobos. We're neither, exactly, having followed our own distinct evolutionary path for millions of years since we shared a common ancestor with either species. But observing them carefully offers a valuable, humbling reminder. Complex tool use, cultural variation passed carefully between generations, and rich, sophisticated social bonds are not unique inventions of modern humans, arriving suddenly, fully formed, from nothing. They are deep, ancient threads, woven quietly through millions of years of shared evolutionary history, long before anything resembling a modern human ever existed. The truest myth to let go of. If we had to choose just one myth to leave behind tonight, above all the others we've gently corrected, it might be this one: the idea that modern and ancient represent a simple, clean line of steady progress, primitive people slowly, predictably improving until they finally, eventually became us, sophisticated and complete. The real story, as we've spent this evening exploring together, was never that tidy. It moved in fits and starts. Long stretches of apparent stillness, hundreds of thousands of years where tools, behavior, and daily life changed remarkably little, were followed by sudden, surprising bursts of change. Different human species existed side by side for enormous stretches of time, some thriving for nearly 2 million years, others, like our own species, comparatively new arrivals still writing our earliest chapters. Skills we associate with sophisticated, modern culture, art, music, careful burial, long-distance trade, cooperative childcare, compassionate care for the vulnerable, all of these appeared far earlier, and far more consistently, than the old, simple story ever gave them credit for. Early humans were not lesser versions of us, waiting patiently to be perfected. They were fully, completely human, in every way that matters, capable of love, grief, curiosity, artistry, and deep, sustained compassion, using the tools, the knowledge, and the time available to them, exactly as we do today, with the tools, knowledge, and time available to us. Perhaps the truest thing we can say, gently, as tonight's stories come to a close, is this. We were never separate from them, looking back from some superior distance. We are them, still. The same species, the same deep well of curiosity and care, simply continuing on, one more quiet chapter in an extraordinarily long, unfinished story. Hunter-gatherers built massive monuments, long before farming. For most of the 20th century, one assumption sat quietly underneath almost every story about early humans. Large, organized construction projects, temples, monuments, massive stone structures, were assumed to require farming first. The logic seemed sound. You need surplus food, permanent settlements, and organized labor to build something big. And you need farming to get surplus food. So monuments, the thinking went, must have come after agriculture, not before it. Then, in the 1990s, archaeologists began excavating a hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, and the discovery quietly overturned that entire assumption. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive carved limestone pillars, some standing over 16 feet tall and weighing many tons, arranged in large circular enclosures, many of them decorated with detailed carvings of foxes, boars, snakes, and birds. And the dating is the truly staggering part. Göbekli Tepe was built roughly 11,600 years ago, which makes it older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years, and older than the pyramids of Giza by roughly 7,000 years. And critically, it was built by people who, according to all the archaeological evidence at the site, were still hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of farming, no domesticated grain, no permanent village of houses surrounding the site, at least not in its earliest layers. This means a group of hunter-gatherers, people we once assumed were too busy simply surviving day to day to organize anything beyond small, mobile camps, somehow coordinated the quarrying, transportation, carving, and raising of massive multi-ton stone pillars, likely requiring dozens, if not hundreds, of people working together over an extended period, all without permanent agriculture to support them. Some researchers now believe the causation may actually run in the opposite direction from what was long assumed. Instead of farming enabling monument building, the enormous, sustained effort of gathering large groups together repeatedly to build and use a site like Göbekli Tepe may have created the very conditions, and the very motivation, that eventually led to farming. Feeding large groups of workers and visitors, gathered periodically at a shared ceremonial site, may have encouraged early experiments with cultivating wild grains nearby, experiments that, over generations, slowly became deliberate agriculture. It's a strange, quiet reversal to sit with as you drift toward sleep. Perhaps it wasn't farming that gave us the first temples. Perhaps, in some real sense, it was the desire to gather, to build something meaningful together, that first gave us farming. The human brain has actually been shrinking. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it, and it runs directly against the tidy old assumption that human evolution has been one long, steady march toward bigger and bigger brains. Researchers studying skull fossils have found that the average human brain reached its largest size roughly somewhere between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago. And since then, over the last 20,000 years or so, the average human brain has actually decreased in size, by some estimates, by roughly the equivalent volume of a tennis ball. This finding, first noticed decades ago and confirmed repeatedly since through further fossil analysis, has puzzled and fascinated researchers for years, and there is, importantly, no single settled explanation. Several thoughtful theories have been proposed, though none of them is proven beyond doubt. One idea suggests that as human societies grew larger and more interconnected, individuals no longer needed to store as much knowledge personally inside their own single brain. In a small, isolated band of 30 people, every single member might have needed to remember an enormous amount of practical, life-or-death knowledge individually, which plants were safe to eat, which were poisonous, how to track specific animals, how to predict weather patterns. In a larger, more organized society, this knowledge could increasingly be distributed and shared across many specialized individuals, each person needing to hold a smaller piece of the whole. Another theory points to body size. As human bodies have, on average, become somewhat smaller since the last ice age, partly due to changes in diet and lifestyle, brain size may have simply scaled down proportionally, since larger bodies generally require and support larger brains. A third, more provocative theory suggests that domestication itself, not of animals, but in a sense of ourselves, as we move toward more settled, cooperative, less physically demanding societies, may parallel the well-documented pattern seen in domesticated animals, who, compared to their wild ancestors, also tend to develop smaller brains relative to body size over many generations. Importantly, a smaller brain does not mean a less capable one. Brain size alone is a surprisingly poor predictor of intelligence, both across species and within our own. What seems to matter far more is brain structure, the density and efficiency of neural connections, rather than raw physical volume. So this is not evidence that we have somehow become less intelligent than our Ice Age ancestors. It's simply a reminder that even something as seemingly fixed and settled as human brain size has kept quietly changing, shrinking as easily as it once grew, across the long, patient timeline of our species. Cavemen died at 30 is a misleading statistic. You've probably heard this one before, often stated as simple, settled fact. Life expectancy in prehistoric times was around 30 years old. It's repeated so often that it's become a kind of shorthand for how brutal and short early human life must have been. The number itself isn't fabricated, but the way it's usually understood is seriously misleading, and once you understand why, an entirely different picture of early human aging emerges. The confusion comes from the difference between life expectancy at birth and how long people actually lived once they survived childhood. life expectancy at birth is an average, and averages are heavily skewed by very high infant and childhood mortality rates, which were indeed tragically common in prehistoric times, and for much of recorded history afterward too, well into the modern era in many parts of the world. If, in a group of 10 people, 4 die in infancy at age 0, and the other 6 live to be 60, the mathematical average life expectancy at birth comes out to 36, even though more than half the group lived a genuinely full, long life. When researchers instead calculate life expectancy for individuals who survived past childhood, say, past age 15, the picture changes dramatically. Studies analyzing skeletal remains and, separately, studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations living traditional lifestyles similar in many ways to prehistoric ones, consistently find that a significant number of individuals lived into their 50s, 60s, and, in a smaller but real number of cases, well beyond that, into what we would today call genuine old age. We've already talked, earlier tonight, about direct evidence of this, Neanderthal and early human skeletons showing individuals who survived severe injuries and illnesses for years, sometimes decades, requiring ongoing care from their community. This kind of long-term survival simply would not appear in the fossil record at all if early humans were, as a rule, dying en masse by their early 30s. Elderly individuals in early human societies, far from being rare or largely absent, appear to have played genuinely important roles, as we discussed earlier regarding grandparents and shared childcare. A society that discarded or lost its older members quickly would have lost enormous amounts of accumulated, hard-won practical knowledge along with them, knowledge about rare food sources, dangerous animals, seasonal patterns spanning many years, knowledge that younger, less experienced members simply hadn't had time yet to learn firsthand. So the next time someone repeats cavemen only lived to 30 as though it settles the matter, you might gently remember tonight's story instead. Prehistoric life was genuinely difficult, and childhood mortality genuinely was tragically high. But for those who made it past those most vulnerable early years, a long life, filled with decades of memory, knowledge, and quiet contribution to their community, was a real and unremarkable possibility, not some rare miracle. Early human skin was not always the color we assume. Here's a myth that touches something people don't often think to question at all, the assumption that early humans in any particular region always looked, skin tone-wise, roughly the way people in that region look today. The genetic evidence tells a considerably more fluid, more surprising story. Skin pigmentation in humans is primarily an adaptation related to sunlight, specifically balancing 2 competing biological needs, protection from ultraviolet radiation damage, which favors darker skin, and the ability to produce enough vitamin D through sun exposure, which becomes more difficult with darker skin in regions that receive less intense sunlight, favoring lighter skin the further a population lives from the equator. Because early modern humans originated in Africa, near the equator, under intense, near-constant sun exposure, the earliest modern humans were very likely dark-skinned, an adaptation well-suited to that intense equatorial environment. As some populations migrated further north, into regions of Europe and Asia with dramatically less intense, and less consistent, sunlight, lighter skin would have offered a genuine survival advantage over many generations, allowing more efficient vitamin D production even in duller, weaker sunlight. Here's the genuinely surprising part, confirmed through careful ancient DNA analysis over the past decade or so. Lighter skin pigmentation among European populations appears to have spread and become dominant considerably more recently than most people assume, in some estimates, within perhaps the last 8,000 years, a relatively short span in the overall story of human evolution. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains found across Europe, dating back roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years, has, in a number of striking cases, revealed individuals who likely had notably darker skin than the average population of that same region carries today, combined, in some specific and well-publicized cases, with blue eyes, a combination that might genuinely surprise many people's assumptions about what ancient Europeans typically looked like. This doesn't mean skin color changed overnight, or all at once, or uniformly. It appears to have been a gradual, ongoing process, different genetic variants for lighter skin spreading through different populations at somewhat different times and paces, continuing to shift and settle for thousands of years after humans first arrived in these northern regions. It's a gentle reminder, worth carrying quietly into sleep tonight. Something as seemingly fixed and simple as skin color has, across the actual span of human history, been remarkably changeable, gradually shifting and adapting, generation after generation, in response to sunlight, geography, and time, rather than representing any fixed, unchanging category at all. Handedness is older than writing, older than farming, older than almost everything. One last, quieter myth to gently set down tonight. It's easy to assume that traits like being right-hand or left-handed are a relatively modern, almost incidental detail of human variation, the sort of thing that wouldn't leave any trace at all in the deep, distant past. In fact, handedness turns out to be one of the more surprisingly ancient, well-documented traits we can actually trace in early humans, thanks to a clever detective technique involving stone tools and teeth. When early humans knapped stone tools, striking one stone against another repeatedly to shape it, the process leaves subtle, consistent patterns of small fracture marks depending on whether the toolmaker was predominantly using their right or left hand. By carefully studying thousands of ancient stone tools from sites spanning well over 1,000,000 years, researchers have found that right-handedness appears to have been the clear, dominant pattern throughout almost the entire span of human prehistory, in roughly similar proportions, around 9 parts right-hand to 1 part left-handed, to what we see in modern human populations today. An entirely separate line of evidence comes from teeth. Early humans and Neanderthals appear to have regularly used their teeth almost like an additional tool, gripping and pulling on hides, plant fibers, or sinew while cutting it with a stone tool held in one hand. This repeated motion left small, consistent scratch marks on the front teeth, and by studying the angle of these tiny scratches under magnification, researchers can determine, with a surprising degree of confidence, which hand the individual predominantly used, since a right-hand person pulling and cutting in this manner leaves scratches angled in a distinctly different direction than a left-handed person would. This evidence, drawn from tools and teeth stretching back well over 1,000,000 years, strongly suggests that the same basic pattern of hand preference seen in humans today, a strong majority right hand, with a smaller, consistent minority left-handed, was already firmly established deep in our evolutionary past, likely connected to the same deep, ancient patterns of brain lateralization, the specialization of the brain's left and right hemispheres for different tasks, that also underlies things like language processing. It's a small, quiet detail to end on. That the particular hand you naturally reach for a cup with tonight, without ever thinking about it, echoes a pattern stretching back over 1,000,000 years, quietly inherited, tool strike after tool strike, generation after generation, long before anyone ever had a word for left or right at all. Early humans likely swam and understood water far better than assumed. There is a common, almost cartoonish image of early humans as creatures who feared open water, clinging nervously to the shoreline, only ever wading in shallow, safe pools. The evidence suggests a far more capable, and far more curious, relationship with water and the sea. We have already talked about the remarkable ocean crossings required to reach islands like Flores, home of the small, now extinct Homo floresiensis, and the broader spread of early humans across the scattered islands of Southeast Asia, journeys that would have required deliberate watercraft and real seafaring knowledge, even during Ice Age periods of lower sea levels. Beyond long-distance crossings, there is extensive evidence that early humans in many regions relied heavily and skillfully on aquatic environments for food. Along the southern coast of Africa, at sites like Pinnacle Point, researchers have found evidence of humans systematically harvesting shellfish, dated to well over 100,000 years ago, timed carefully, it appears, to specific tidal patterns, requiring detailed, accumulated knowledge of that coastline passed down across generations. This was not occasional, opportunistic snacking. It was a genuine, structured food-gathering strategy, requiring real understanding of tides, currents, and seasonal changes in marine life. There is also growing evidence of deliberate fishing using specialized tools. Barbed bone harpoon points, clearly designed for catching large fish, have been found at sites in Central Africa dating back roughly 90,000 years, among some of the oldest known deliberately shaped bone tools anywhere in the world. Catching large, fast-moving fish with a hand-thrown harpoon requires real skill, patience, and an intimate, practiced understanding of a river or lake's particular rhythms, where fish gather when they are most active, how to properly aim and time a throw. Rivers and coastlines, far from being obstacles early humans merely tolerated, appear to have functioned as genuine highways and pantries, reliable, resource-rich environments that likely shaped migration routes, settlement patterns, and daily life for many early human populations, especially as groups gradually spread out of Africa and across new, unfamiliar landscapes, often following coastlines and rivers precisely because they offered dependable food and, quite possibly, easier, faster travel than trekking across difficult, unpredictable inland terrain. So if you find yourself near water tonight, even just the quiet, distant sound of rain outside, or a fountain, or waves, you might let yourself feel, gently, how old that comfort really is. Long before anyone built a boat with sails, before anyone charted a single coastline on a map, early humans were already reading the water carefully, trusting it, and depending on it, generation after generation. The first human homes were more sophisticated than we imagine. We have already gently corrected the myth that early humans lived permanently and exclusively in caves. But it is worth spending a little more time on what their actual shelters looked like, because the level of engineering involved, even in supposedly simple, temporary structures, is genuinely impressive. At a site called Mezhirik, in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered the remains of dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones, dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, during a period when wood would have been extremely scarce on the open, treeless steppe. These structures used carefully selected mammoth skulls, jawbones, and long limb bones, arranged deliberately to form a stable circular foundation and framework, likely then covered with hides for insulation and weatherproofing. Building one of these structures would have required disassembling and transporting the bones of multiple mammoths, an enormous undertaking requiring real planning, cooperation, and structural knowledge, quite literally engineering a home out of the skeletal remains of the very animals that fed the people living inside it. Elsewhere, at sites across Europe dating back over 20,000 years, archaeologists have found evidence of structures with genuine internal organization, distinct areas apparently set aside for sleeping, for tool-making, for food preparation, and for the central hearth, suggesting these were not simple, undifferentiated shelters, but organized living spaces reflecting deliberate, shared decisions about how a household should function. Even the more commonly used lightweight, temporary shelters, made from bent branches, hides, and readily available plant material, required real technical skill to construct properly, ensuring they could withstand wind and rain, retain warmth from a central fire, and be quickly assembled and disassembled as a group moved with the seasons. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups who still build similar temporary shelters today have noted that experienced individuals can construct a stable, weatherproof shelter in under an hour, using nothing but immediately available natural materials and generations of carefully passed down, practical knowledge. None of this fits the old, simple image of early humans passively hiding in whatever dark cave happened to be nearby. It suggests, instead, resourceful builders, patiently adapting their construction techniques to whatever materials a given landscape offered, whether that meant bending saplings on a forest hillside, or carefully stacking mammoth bones on a bare, windswept plain. Mitochondrial Eve was not the first woman. One more myth deserves gentle correction before we let this all rest, because it's one of the most commonly misunderstood ideas in all of human evolutionary science, the idea of mitochondrial Eve. You may have heard the phrase before, sometimes presented dramatically, as though scientists discovered evidence of a single, literal first woman, and Eve, from whom every human being alive today directly descends. It sounds almost biblical, almost like ancient science suddenly confirming an old story. But the reality, while still remarkable, is quite different, and far less like a single origin point than the phrase suggests. Mitochondrial DNA is a small, distinct piece of genetic material passed down only through the mother, generation after generation, largely unchanged except for slow, gradual mutations over time. By comparing mitochondrial DNA across many different populations around the world today, scientists can trace these maternal lines backward, further and further, until, mathematically, all of these different lines converge on a single common ancestor, a woman who lived, according to current estimates, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago, likely in Africa. But here's the important, often missed detail. This woman was almost certainly not the only woman alive at that time, and she was not, in any meaningful sense, the first human. She lived among many other women, in many other family groups, all across the region. It's simply that, over the tens of thousands of years since then, the maternal lines belonging to those other women eventually died out, not necessarily because those other women's lives were worse, or their families less successful, but often simply due to ordinary chance, a family line, over enough generations, having only sons, or facing hardship, and eventually the specific unbroken maternal thread quietly ending, while one particular thread, belonging to this one woman, happened to continue, unbroken, all the way to today. It's a bit like reaching far back into a large, old family tree and discovering that only one specific, narrow branch of great-great-great-grandmother's bloodline survived intact enough to be traced. It doesn't mean the other branches, the other women, weren't real, weren't important, weren't loved. It simply means their specific unbroken maternal genetic thread didn't happen to survive multiple tens of thousands of years intact. So a mitochondrial Eve wasn't a lone first woman in a garden, and she certainly wasn't alone. She lived, loved, and likely raised her children in a community, surrounded by many other women whose descendants are also, in countless other ways, still walking the earth today, connected through fathers, through other maternal lines further back, through the enormous, tangled web of human ancestry that connects every single person alive right now, more closely than most of us ever stop to consider. Dogs may have joined us earlier than we thought. One final, gentle story before we close completely, because it involves a companionship that many of us still share, quite literally, in our own homes tonight. For a long time, the domestication of dogs from wild wolves was thought to have occurred somewhere around 15,000 years ago, alongside the early beginnings of settled human communities. More recent genetic research has pushed this estimate significantly earlier, with some studies suggesting the process may have begun 20, 30, or even upward of 40,000 years ago, during a period when humans were still living as mobile hunter-gatherers, long before anything resembling permanent villages existed. The most widely supported theory suggests this early relationship likely began gradually, and mutually, rather than through any single deliberate act of humans choosing to tame a wild wolf. Wolves that were naturally a little less fearful of humans may have begun following human hunting groups at a cautious distance, drawn by the scraps and leftovers left behind at butchering sites and camps. Over many, many generations, the wolves that were most comfortable, most tolerant of human presence, would have had greater access to this reliable food source, while humans, in turn, likely benefited from having these less fearful wolves nearby, an early warning system against approaching predators or rival groups, alerting the camp with barks and restless movement long before a human might have noticed anything at all. Slowly, gradually, over thousands of years, this loose, mutually beneficial arrangement deepened into something closer to what we'd recognize today, wolves gradually becoming more docile, more attuned to human behavior and emotion, eventually becoming a distinct, domesticated companion species, dogs, that stayed close to human groups not out of simple necessity, but, it increasingly appears, out of something closer to genuine attachment. There is a burial site in Germany, dated to roughly 14,000 years ago, where archaeologists found a man, a woman, and a young dog buried together. Careful analysis showed the dog had survived a serious illness for weeks before eventually dying, an illness that would have left it unable to be useful for hunting or guarding during that time. And yet, the evidence suggests, it was cared for anyway, kept alive, kept warm, kept fed, purely, it seems, out of attachment, until it eventually passed, and was buried, deliberately, alongside two humans who, in some way we can only imagine now, clearly loved it. So if there happens to be a dog curled up somewhere near you tonight, resting quietly at the foot of your bed, or in another room nearby, you might let yourself feel, gently, just how old that particular comfort really is. Tens of thousands of years old. One of the oldest, warmest threads connecting your quiet night to night, all the way back to fires that went out an unimaginably long time ago. We've traveled a long way together tonight. From the very first ancestors who stood upright on the grasslands of Africa, to the flicker of the first controlled fires, to hands shaping stone with patient, practiced care. We've walked beside Neanderthals who nursed their wounded back to health. We've listened, in our imagination, to a bone flute played into the cold night air, tens of thousands of years ago. We've stood at the edge of the sea, watching early humans time their harvest of shellfish to the rhythm of the tides. None of it needs to be remembered now. All of it can simply settle, quietly, into the back of your mind, the way sediment settles slowly to the bottom of a still, calm lake. Let's take a moment now, just to breathe. Breathe in, slowly, and out. Breathe in again, and let it go. There's nothing else you need to do right now. Nothing to solve. Nothing to plan. Nothing to remember. Just this breath. And the next one. And the one after that. Imagine, if you'd like, a small fire somewhere far back in time. Not a wild, dangerous fire, but a small, steady one, carefully tended, glowing orange and gold in the dark. Imagine the quiet murmur of low voices nearby, the unhurried, comfortable, the kind of conversation that doesn't need to go anywhere, doesn't need to reach a point. Just warmth. Just company. Just the simple, ancient comfort of not being alone in the dark. Somewhere, 100,000 years ago, someone laid down at the end of a long day, muscles tired, mind slowly quieting, and let sleep come, the same way it's coming for you now. Somewhere, 75,000 years ago, someone carefully engraved a small, careful pattern into a piece of ochre, and then, satisfied, set it aside, and closed their eyes. Somewhere, 34,000 years ago, two children were laid gently to rest, surrounded by thousands of small ivory beads, each one placed there by hands that loved them. Somewhere, 17,000 years ago, someone looked up at a full moon, the same moon you might glimpse tonight, and carefully carved a small notch into a piece of bone, marking its quiet, steady phase. You are the newest chapter in an extraordinarily old story. Every breath you take tonight is the same breath, in its most basic form, that every human before you has ever taken. Every soft, safe feeling of finally lying down at the end of a long day is the same feeling countless generations have felt before you, all the way back, further than we can really imagine, to the very first humans who ever lived. You don't have to hold on to anything else tonight. Let the myths fall away. Let the facts fall away too, if they need to. Just let yourself rest, safely, warmly, exactly where you are. Asterisk, longer pause here, allow real silence, asterisk. If your mind wanders, that's all right. Let it wander gently, without any pressure to follow it anywhere in particular. Thoughts may drift by like slow clouds, and you don't need to chase any of them. Just watch them pass, softly, and let your body continue to sink a little more into wherever you're resting. Feel the weight of your own body right now. Heavy. Settled. Supported completely by whatever is beneath you. There is nothing holding you up right now, except rest itself. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench, just slightly. Let your hands rest, open and loose, wherever they happen to be. There is nothing left to hold onto tonight. Asterisk, longer pause here, allow real silence, asterisk. Imagine, one more time, that quiet fire from so long ago. The gentle crackle. The soft orange light against tired faces. The low, comfortable murmur of voices that don't need to say anything important, just voices, keeping each other company in the dark, the way humans have always done, the way humans always will. And one by one, imagine the voices around that fire growing quieter. Not stopping, just softening, the way a conversation naturally softens, when everyone around it is growing pleasantly, comfortably tired. The fire settles into gentle embers. The voices fade into a soft, comfortable silence. And one by one, around that fire, in that image, in your mind, everyone slowly, peacefully, falls asleep. Asterisk, longer pause here. Allow real silence, asterisk. You can let yourself do the same now, if you're ready. There's nowhere else you need to be. Nothing else you need to remember. Just this quiet moment. This soft, steady breath. This gentle, ancient invitation to rest, passed down, quietly, for hundreds of thousands of years, all the way to you tonight. Sleep well.